Hello, and welcome to Reawakening the Sacred Self, deepening our connection with our authentic soul. We have gathered together Indigenous elders, wisdom keepers, spiritual teachers, healers, and inspirational speakers to share their wisdom and insights as to how we can integrate our spiritual practices more deeply into our everyday lives, thus deepening our connection with our authentic soul. My name is Frances Billinghurst, your host for and the creatrix of this event, and I'm coming to you from Kaurna country here in South Australia. As such, I acknowledge the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains as being the traditional custodians upon this land that I reside. So, mani ngā padme, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am delighted to welcome Daniel Giamario. Daniel, thank you very much for being part of this event.
My pleasure being with you again, Frances. Thanks for asking me.
More than welcome. For anyone who is not familiar with his work, Daniel is the co-founder of the Turning of the Ages Mystery School and the creator of the shamanic astrology paradigm. He has been studying astrology since the late 1960s and was part of Don Rodgers' transpersonal astrology movement back in the 1970s. After a vision quest experience in 1981, Daniel's astrological vision and spiritual path became more earth-centric and shamanically orientated. And his shamanically orientated astrology was born. For many years, his specialty has been connecting astrology to the night sky at its secluded locations and sacred sites in and as above, so below direct experience. He has been a full-time astrological consultant since 1984, and today has a large mentoring practice and also an apprenticeship program. The Giamario approach has basically evolved as a rich blend of psychological, mythological, spiritual, and shamanistic elements specifically designed to assist in the unfoldment of the individual's life purpose and in navigating this pivotal point in the turning of the ages.
Yes.
Daniel is also the author of 2 books, the Shamanic Astrology Handbook and the Origins of Shamanic Astrology Paradigm, both of which can be found on his website, which is listed under this recording. And he's also produced the Shamanic Astrology Divination Card Deck. He lives with his wife, Lynn, in Southeast Asia, where his passion is the growing of the Turning of the Ages Mystery School's body of knowledge, furthering the evolution of the Giamario approach and continued research to obtain the answers to his lifelong questions: who are we? And what has happened? And as Daniel has mentioned, and for anybody who did watch last year's Reawakening the Sacred Self, I'm very honored to have Daniel back again, and we will be continuing our discussion about aligning with life's purpose at this great turning of the ages. So, Daniel, I thought for the benefit of anybody who may not have joined us in our last discussion, maybe we can start by you explaining what is meant by the turning of the ages. So
Yes, actually, it was in the 1980s, mid 1980s, when I started taking groups of people out under the sky and camping on the land and learning how working with a chart is more powerful when you're actually knowing the stars and the planetary patterns, the starry pattern, the constellational groups and things like that. So actually one of the ingredients of this paradigm is how the constellational groups inform the signs And so that's something that actually shifts over 26,000 years. So you have every constellation in alignment with every sign. I won't get into the depth of that at the moment, but in the 80s, I was one of only two astrologers that were actually doing that. I'm actually putting people on the ground with the stars. In fact, when I created the school back in the 80s, the first form of the school, I felt that you should not, I didn't want to train anyone to be an astrologer unless they knew the night sky. And so that was maybe the Earth centered approach to it. And before that, I was more of an Eastern philosophy kind of guy. But then I became much more ground centered and Neo-Ptolemaic from the ground. And anyway, it was during that time period that it was actually originally sourced by a book called Hamlet's Mill that came out in 1969. And that was the very first time that anything appeared in print to describe what became known as galactic alignment, which was the situation that would happen when the solstices or equinoxes would align with the intersection of the plane of the solar system and the plane of the galaxy. So that you have in the sky two crosses. One cross is near galactic center, and the other cross is near the galactic edge. So essentially, working with that in the 80s, I sourced the imagery called the turning of the ages, and that's been a foundational element since that time. But since that time period, from research and experience, way more information has come through regarding the significance of the time we're in now. Now, when I say the time we're in now, we could say, what would be the time period of the great turning of the ages? If you use the precessional cycle, of which 1 degree every 360, 360 degrees in a circle, 1 degree is 72 years. Now, we determined from astronomers that the exact center point was in 1998. That was the point of the most exact galactic alignment, or the time when the solstices were aligned with those two planes. Native American traditions knew about this, indigenous people knew about this, but very few modern astrologers were aware of this. So it turned out, using that 1 degree every 72 years, we have ascertained that the Great Turning is from 1962 to 2034. And in my more extensive presentations on that time period, 1962 to 2034, kind of go through all the different things. I mean, it started with the 7-planet alignment in Aquarius in 1962, but there's many things that happened through the 60s. In fact, at the end of the 1960s was that whole glamorization of the age of Aquarius, the dawning of the age of Aquarius. In our school, we're not, to coin a phrase, we're not spring equinox or we're not March equinox chauvinists. So we basically think of all 4 points turning. So basically the 4 big, usually called fixed constellations, are now aligned with the solstices and the equinoxes. And that only happens about every 6,500 years. So you have the bull, and you have the lion, and you have the eagle or scorpion, and you have the human that are aligned with the solstices and the equinoxes. So we're in a great turning, but how great of a turning is it? For sure, it's the end and the beginning of a 26,000-year cycle, but there could be more to the great turning than what I've just said. And that's this. You wanted me to share the most recent research on that, about where we are.
Yes. Do you want me to call up the image that you've sent through? Okay.
And actually, this is something that any time these days that I give any kind of presentation, whether it's to astrologers or to the general public, I like to start with this. I mean, depending on the background of the audience, I might spend a long time on this, or just a short time, only be a short time right now, so you can actually get a sense of what's going on. In 2012, there was brand new research that came out of India regarding the yugas, which changed what a lot of people thought. Like there's a lot of really tremendous thinkers, like even Rudolf Steiner, and I'm very strongly into the Steiner material. In fact, astrosophy is really one of the elements that went into this paradigm. Anyway, they thought at that time the end of Kali Yuga was the end of the 1800s. But they were using old data and an older way of understanding this. The new material shows up, and I'll just go through each one of these. We'll start with the astrological ages. One entire precessional cycle, and that's the second column there. It's about 25,920 years. Most people then divide that up into 12, we could say 12 months in a great year. And so each age is like a month in the greater year. And this is the dates. And this is all based upon the 1998 alignment of the solstices with the planes of the galaxy and the solar system. And so you can see the dates of the different ages, and the ages are named after it's really the constellation, but we're using here the sign name, and a lot of people interchange those. We don't, but here I'm using the sign name that's generally attributed to the constellation. And you can see here that if we go back to the 30,000 years ago, there was an Aries age, and then the previous Aquarian age was over 25,000 years ago, and now we're relative to the March equinox. We have that relative to that equinox, we're back to Aquarius. Okay, for the March equinox. I'm very cognizant of the globe, the entire globe. So I use the names of the equinoxes and the solstices based upon the month, rather than the season, if you follow what I mean. Okay. So here, this is this very distinct 25,920 year time period, of which relative to the March equinox, we entered into the Aquarian segment in 1998. Okay. And that would apply to the other ones too, the entrance into the Taurian age, the Scorpion age, the water bearer age, and the lion age. If you look at the other solstices and the other equinox, the other solstice and the two equinoxes. Now, if you go to the yugas, based on this new research, one entire yugic cycle is 25,352 years, almost exactly the same. And this was the schemata that was designed by this man from India in 2012. And it shows the different yugas, when the golden age last was, and then now we are essentially right at the bottom of the Kali Yuga. But it's interesting that one entire cycle is almost exactly the same as the precessional cycle. Meanwhile, there's another framework, which is the Aztec, Toltec, some Hopi view that we're entering into the sixth sun. So what they did is they divided the precessional cycle into 5 segments, which were the different suns. And so their view is that from 2012 to 2021 was the entrance or the beginning of the sixth sun. And in general, their view was that the sixth sun is the same as the first sun. So we could say everything starts over, is another way you can put it. And if we go back to the astrological ages for a moment, I personally, based on some of the other research I've done and some of the other researchers that I follow, it could well be, and this is one of the things that I think is true, is that it's 12 precessional cycles that we're at the end and the beginning of. So that actually takes our history, our form of human being back at over 300,000 years. By the way, just as an aside, since I'm speaking to someone from Australia, I've also been very much interested in this material that's come out of Australia, which in the short form of it is called Into Africa, not Out of Africa, which is basically that based on DNA research, it's impossible based on the complexity of the DNA that it came out of Africa, that it actually had to have gone back to the Aboriginals. But that's controversial, but I think it's true. You're probably familiar with what I'm talking about.
Just a little bit, yes. Yes. There's a lot of
So
stuff
actually,
coming
we're
under.
looking at over 300,000 years. But if we bring the yugas into it, that previous Kali yugas, and Kali Yuga is the deepest descent. In fact, Robert Lawler, who's one of my favorite sources of information, he wrote this amazing book on what is it called? Voices of the First Time. Almost all of it is Aboriginal kind of things. And he now currently lives in Tasmania, and he basically says the only time patrilineal traditions or patriarchy happens, it only happens near the end. It only happens in a Kali Yuga. It does not exist in the other yugas. Prior to that, it's always matrilineal. And so that basically patriarchy is a sign of the end of a time period, that it only can happen when things are really dense. But compared to, say, 12 astrological ages, this particular end of the Kali Yuga and the end of the processional age is the densest one ever. So that spirit has come into matter at a level of density that has never happened before. And most of the speculation is very much like the Aztec and Toltec 5 suns, that when you get to the 6th sun, it starts over. And so that's why I don't think that at the end of this time period that we just have a slow ascent back to a golden age, but rather it's either the entire end of this whole experiment, or it bifurcates into individuals that are like that are creating a new world, an entirely new world. So that's a controversial view, but I pretty much think that's the case. Meanwhile, I've added into this the different processional stars, the different stars that were the North Star. So it's very intriguing that the only star that was ever a quote North Star that was right in the Milky Way was the star Deneb, and that happened to be the North Star right in the at the beginning, in the middle of the Golden Age. And a lot of people, in fact, you all in Australia probably are going to be more open to this than Europeans. But the European history is so Eurocentric, and so that's like, oh, how could anything have happened, 15, 16, 17,000 years ago? Well, that part of the world was covered in ice, but that doesn't mean all was. In fact, around the equator and other parts of the world, there was things are going along pretty well. And that's the whole Sunderland hypothesis, which goes into a lot of my work also. So then we have geological time. And so it turns out that the last glacial maximum was, you can see the dates, and the maximum glaciation was 26,500 years ago. And then we have deglaciation, and then we have the younger Dryas time period. And that was when the great floods were happening. And in fact, I live in the Philippines, and so the entire area of the South China Sea was, it's very shallow. And at that time period, it was above water. It was all inundated, so that it was really an area of much fertility and civilization, a different kind of civilization, but certainly not the kind we have now, which is a purely technological one. It was, or we could say, it was a different form of technology. And then, last but not least, in these converging timelines, would be the one that has very little to do with astrology. There's a book that is well known in America called The Fourth Turning, and it was a speculation that was inspired by the Etruscans, who for 1,000 years, pre-Roman, that noticed that any given time in history, in any time in their history, the oldest elder was about 90 years old. And so they called that a saeculum. And then in the course of 90 years, 4 generations would turn over. And then it would be a restart at that point. Now, I've used that in a number of different ways beyond the scope of our conversation today. That I've used it as far as the understanding of the timeline of the individual life. I consider at this time in our shared history that the archetypal lifespan of a human being is 3 Saturn returns. So therefore, like 88 to 90, something like that. And then you have 4 generations to turn over in that period of time. And so what this work, the fourth turning, does is it looks at European history and particularly American history, but that would include like the Crown colonies and the Five Eyes, and they're all part of the same thing as European history. That if you follow all of that quote history, that it turns out that we're at the end of a fourth turning, and 2025 is the end of a fourth turning. And according to U.S. history, the way it lines up is that there was a fourth turning at the Civil War, American Civil War, and also right before World War II was a fourth turning, and now we're at another fourth turning. So if we bring all of those things together, we're talking about something which is why it's not just any old turning of the ages, but it's the great turning, Okay, so that's this like larger overview of where we're coming from here.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Daniel. It sounds like a very pivotal time that we're actually in at the moment. Yes. So it's no wonder we're seeing like our structures of our societies beginning to crumble and people not really knowing what to do or where to go. So as an astrologer generally, can you sort of give anybody or give us all a little bit of guidance as to how best we can sort of cope with all these changes going ahead?
Well, I'm very fortunate, and that is that the great majority of the people in our school, in the Turning of the Ages Mystery School, as well as probably 90% of my clientele, are all pretty awake. So I mean, I don't have a general cross section of the people I work with. So I think what Harry Potter calls it muggles or normies or what. So they're not ones that seek out a session from me. But if I was to apply this to everybody at a great turning, there's no question the most important thing, and this certainly shows up in the people who come for sessions. They're interested now more than anything in life purpose, because I personally believe that every human being does have a purpose, and if one is submerged in consensus reality, that there's not a great deal of guidance as to the wide spectrum of possibilities of what an authentic self would be. So a lot of times the function of an astrologer, and I got this from Dane Rajar, my original mentor, the responsibility of the astrologer, even if a person is not ready to hear it, is that at some point in the session to give them clues about what their life purpose is. And while there may be other times, slowed down time periods in history, where something like a Buddhist approach, it doesn't matter this life, we have 1,000 more lifetimes, that actually there's a certain urgency in recapitulating what our karmic history has been. And so that we'll meet all the people we have karma with. But more than anything, even in the midst of an entire potential breakdown of the entire system, which is very possible, even the Aboriginals would agree with this, is it cannot go on the way it's going on. I mean, during Kali Yuga, everything is materialistic. Science becomes scientism. The Rockefeller medical establishment wanted to disconnect from soul and spirit, and making everything materialistic. So basically, one of the things I've always noticed, I've never had anyone push back on this. I always say at the beginning of any session, when you come into the life, you're not a blank slate. you come in with certain spiritual essence, certain qualities that predate your encounter with the family group you're born into, or the culture you're born into, the time in history you're born into. And no one has ever pushed back on that, even though a great majority of established psychology and is behavioristic. It's like it's a blank slate kind of thing. And the current technocratic overlords believe that we are blank slates and we can be reprogrammed the way they would want. So, but our approach is different, which is there are clues on the chart of the intention of the soul in the current life. So one of the things that distinguishes our system from a lot, I'm not saying all, but the thing we're looking at most of the chart as being a set of instructions, like an intention. It's not like saying, "Oh, this is how you are. Oh, I'm not that way," but rather that it's a set of instructions for what a person is learning here to learn about, and that's very often not the path of least resistance. So to me, the most important thing is to assist people as quickly as possible to know what their life purpose is. And there's so many different places on the wheel of life that you could be on. I mean, one person might have a place that maybe they're Scorpio rising, and so they want to be more of an activist. They want to call out the shadow. A Sag rising or an Aquarius rising may want to take a path that's more about, I'm just going to step back and be objective. I'm not going to engage, shall we say. I'm being very generalist there, but there's different places on the wheel, and we can't say one approach is better or worse than another. There's a variety of different ones, and if you are approaching it that way, it does not really even matter what happens. I mean, let's say that something happened in Australia or any country, pick any country, where it's impossible in the next 6 months to ever grow a crop again. But if you are a gardener, you still garden. Or if your dharma is to be a parent, well, there's many people who might say, why would I want to bring children into the world right now? But if your dharma is to be a parent, you have kids. I mean, that's following your dharma. So being able to figure out what the dharma is, I think, the main function of an astrologer today. Are you with me?
Yeah, definitely. And it's just like sort of gives, as you said, life's purpose, and we're having to dig a little bit deeper to find out, sort of as you said, getting away from the pre-programmed of society back to
Right.
what we sort of came in with on a deeper soul essence.
Right.
And there's so many distractions, almost like society's purposely putting out these distractions to keep us off track.
Well, I'll give you an example of one of the things that distinguishes our approach, and I'm not saying we're the only ones. I mean, Ridjar would agree, Steiner would agree, Jung would agree, which is that evolution never happens in the collective. It always happens with the individual. And so, and in fact, as a child of the 60s, and I very much experienced before the timeline split in the summer of 1968. Before that, my generation, at least 50% of us, were very much forward-looking, and very idealistic, and we were like opponents of what at that time was called the establishment. Unfortunately, that timeline shifted after that, and I can remember exactly when it happened. It happened in the summer of 1968 when I was watching the Democratic Convention, and I saw the dark forests come down and overtake. This was, of course, the summer of MLK's and Robert Kennedy's assassinations. There's a kind of a dark spell that came down when the American CIA essentially took over the government. It was a coup d'etat that happened at that point, and that's increased. And anyway, to be able to see how this has happened since that time is the overall, broad, just in my own life. I mean, in 1962, 1963, I mean, it was 14 when Kennedy, when the JFK was killed, and I remember that quite clearly. And we call that the killing of the three kings, the ritual slaying of those individuals that could have taken the world in a different direction. Then there's other time periods where the timeline splits. 1998, it happened again in early 2022. And we're kind of now at a time period where I don't think anyone knows exactly what's going to happen. It's really up in the air.
Mm.
And as far as what my own life purpose is, it is to assist an individual in getting what their place on the wheel is, what their life purpose is. And then in that sense, it doesn't really matter, because if we have a connection to our soul and to our spirit and to our authentic self, there's a lot of things worse than death.
Mm. And as you mentioned, it was sort of like this pivotal time of all these sort of timelines converging. And also, I mean, I'm not an astrologer myself, but I have been keeping probably a more conscious eye on transits and what other astrologers have been saying. And there's a lot of stuff happening that
Yes.
is out there. In particular, you did mention before we started this broadcast, with a lot of transits coming up in 2024, and where they're actually crossing, in particular to America, which are really interesting areas. So we'll go to
one of the things, I'll just give you a couple examples. Back in 2017, our school created a summit, and it was called Preparing for 2020. And that was looking ahead and, of course, noticing the global configuration of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto aligned. I don't think any of us in 2017 exactly called out what exactly would happen in 2020, but we knew something huge would occur at that point. So we now actually at the end of the year have one called Preparing for 2025, and you can see why we're doing that. It's because that's the end of the fourth turning, the bottoming out of Kali Yuga, and so on. And also a very pivotal point in the precessional cycle and the sixth sun and all of that. The number one thing I see as far as the configuration to keep your eye on right now is the Jupiter-Uranian alignment. Now, there has not been a Jupiter-Uranian conjunction in Taurus since 1940, 1941. The alignment of Jupiter with Uranus at any given sign only happens about every 83 years. And so I'm looking at that, particularly zeroing in on the time in April, next April, because April is what is called the Great American Eclipse. There's an eclipse of over 4 minutes that goes across the central part of continental US. Our school is having an event around that in Ohio, and that's the area of America where there's like hundreds and hundreds of pre-colonial mound structures that are aligned with the moon and the sun and lunar standstill. And 2024, 2025 is also the lunar standstill. It's another thing at that time period, which is when the moon is most extremely out of bounds. I'm a great lover of the far north, and I've been to the Great Stone Circle at Callanish in the Outer Hebrides 13 times, and we're taking a group there next June for the lunar standstill that happens directly there where the moon walks on the land. But the thing about April is the Jupiter-Uranian exact conjunction. They're within 10 degrees now. So any birth chart of anyone born now would have a Jupiter-Uranian conjunction, but the exact conjunction is in April, and that's of course the month of that eclipse. But there's also an eclipse happening in October 14th of this year. That's actually a total eclipse, but the moon is a little too small to cover the whole sun, so it's called an annular eclipse. So it's a ring eclipse, and they're great. I don't know if you ever experienced one, but I experienced the one in 2012, And this is one that also, the one in 2012 covers the same track almost exactly as the one in 2023. It goes across New Mexico, and our place in where we're holding the event is a place called Faywood Hot Springs, where I had the opportunity to design and have built a large stone circle on the top of a hill at the hot springs. And that's where we're going to have our event. But then we'll go over to the center line. You probably, I don't know if you all in Australia, are you aware of the so-called Roswell incident?
I am, yes, yes. That's
Well, the
yes.
place where they allegedly found the crashed discs was actually not Roswell. It- are you ready for this? The closest place was named Corona. Corona, New
Interesting.
Mexico. Seriously, and that's this, and the 2012 eclipse goes across the same area, and mainly during 1947, 48, there were all of these different sightings and crashed. Socorro, New Mexico, Aztec, New Mexico, and both eclipse paths cross over the same area, including the Los Alamos lab where they, did the Manhattan Project, and also the Trinity site where the first nuclear explosion happened is where this track is. And I don't find it to be accidental that there's been a lot of attention on this with the release of that movie Oppenheimer, which was talking about that a lot. And so that was in people's consciousness. Well, here we have this eclipse track across America. It's very rare, really. I mean, I've never seen it where in the space of 13 years, um, 11 years, that the same track and two annular eclipses that cross the same area, and then also the big one in April. And in fact, if you combine the 2017 eclipse across America, the 2012 one, and the 2023 one and the 2024 one, they crisscross. The paths crisscross all over the place and all over the continental U.S. Now, also Mexico. I mean, I don't want to leave that out, but it's that area is really in the spotlight, and I think that that's the universe giving us clues, and so I've been following it both historically and even esoteric history about the significance of that path. Meanwhile, the United States is also in their Pluto return, which actually, depending on what criterion you use for the initiatory window, one criterion is that it would end on October 10th of this year. But then there's the fifth Chiron return for the United States that covers all of 2024 through February of 2025. And so there's a lot going on in the U.S. chart. Because I haven't lived in the United States for quite some time, and I've not lived there, maybe half my life I've not been in the United States. So I'm not usually like to be American centric, but my goodness, to have four of them centered in on the continental US since 2012, there must be something going on here, plus the Pluto return and the Chiron return. What, and for good or ill, most of the so-called developed world and even the undeveloped world are influenced by what happens in the United States, and it's, to me, the U.S. and has lost track of its original vision. And basically, the meaning of Pluto is that what is no longer um, life supporting or useful or healthy gets composted.
Do you also think, because Chiron is the wounded healer and Jupiter sort of expands everything it touches,
Right.
and Taurus is also connected with values, these things that all sort of like America's getting a good look at itself, and
I hope
who
so. I
knows?
mean, this is basically what I've been teaching for a good number of years, that the shadow of America is on the front lines, and Jung actually warned against this even in the early 50s. That if the West did not deal with their shadow, then he didn't see much of a future. It's really basically the end of that particular project. And every time the U.S. has had a Chiron return, they have not learned what their fracture point or their wounding is, or yeah, and the Pluto return is there to reveal where the shadow is and compost so that something new gets born out of it.
And as you said, okay, it might be American centric, but we're in a world these days where we're not isolated, and what does happen in America seems to filter through all over the world. I know, especially here in Australia, we tend to be getting, I say, very Americanized in certain areas. Even our politics is becoming, some people have made comments about how Americanized it is compared to what it used to be, whether it's social media or just the influence coming through.
Yeah, without question. And in fact, where I'm living here, I mean, I'm here in the Philippines, and the Philippines is pretty much, since the new president came in, the son of the notorious dictator who was groomed in Oxford, and Bong Bong Marcos. Ever since he came in, they've expanded the bases. So there's now 9 U.S. bases in Philippines, and they want to expand it even more. And here in this part of Asia, it's the only country that's like that. I mean, you have to go up to Korea and Japan, or you have to go down to New Zealand, or even more so Australia, to see the U.S. influence, while the other countries around here are trying their best to maintain their neutrality.
So it'll be very interesting to see what is going to be happening in America, with this eclipse and with everything else that's happening astrologically.
Well, most of these bases are happening in the northern part of the Philippines, right across the Taiwan Strait. And that's a very actually, if you go to the farthest island north of the North Philippines on a really clear day, you can see all the way over to Taiwan, and that's where most of all of the cables are laid. 95% of the communication cables are right in that area. So that's what the U.S. is putting all these bases in the north now. We're watching that very carefully. It's tricky because there's really only 2 countries. I don't know about Australia at this point, but they did a survey once about what are the only 2 countries. There's only 2 countries in the world that more than 50% of the population have a good opinion of America today. And one of them is the Philippines, and the other is Ireland. But so as an American, I guess I get benefit that here, but I don't identify with my country's up to.
Yes, and I think it can also be same with other countries too. Here in Australia, yes, we've been forced to look in our own mirror, and it's not a pretty sight as well. So, oh, this is really fascinating, Daniel. Thank you very much. We are actually coming to the end, unfortunately. Yes. So, yes, I would like to first take this opportunity of thanking you for coming back again and sharing your deep insights and wisdom about the turning of the ages. And while I've got you here, I understand that you have an offering for our audience, which actually ties in with your talk about the turning of the ages, and there's actually some information packs in relation to.
Yeah, I'll make that available to everyone who's registered for this, which is 3 or 4. It's articles and videos on what in more depth as far as what it is that I was bringing up to you at the beginning here.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And then also, if I could suggest, I mean, we have a free newsletter, and so it comes out twice a month on the new moon and full moon. And all you have to do is go to our website, turningoftheages.com, and you just put your email in, and you'll get on our newsletter list, and that has a lot of content. In fact, the website has just hours and hours and hours and hours of free content. So the Turning of the Ages mysteryschool.com.
And the links will be all below the recording as well. So yes, and I am a subscriber to your newsletter, so I do highly recommend it as well. And you did mention some of the events that you've got coming up. Would you like to talk a little bit more about them?
Well, we have every equinox time and every solstice time, we have free seminars. And so I'm going to have one tomorrow and the next day. Tomorrow, the one is on the Venus and Mars, the way we use Venus and Mars to create the inner sacred marriage process, using those planets to create wholeness. And then the one after that is on the eclipses. And then we have that summit coming up we're calling it a council, not a summit. I'm kind of that word reminds me of war councils, but so we have a 3-day council of having different subjects about 2024 and 2025 at the end of the year. And then we have this eclipse gathering, and then next year we have 2 in-person events. One is in Ohio that I mentioned, and then there's one at Callanish for the moon walking on the land, which is a whole other thing we could have talked about, but it's, beyond the scope of this conversation right now. But I have a lot of material on the lunar standstill.
And for
And
members of our
and our school, we have a certification program too. That didn't say that at the beginning. So we train people to do this type of astrology and to learn the night sky at the same time.
That's it. And just because I'm in the Southern Hemisphere, can I throw the spanner in the works? Is the certification course Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, or doesn't it matter? Because I know our constellations are different.
Global. Actually, one of our members of our team has done some pretty extensive research, which is about explaining, using the astronomy and the Earth's place in the solar system and in general overall space, why the tropical zodiac works in both hemispheres. And it's very compelling. It's because the Earth is tilted always directional toward the north. Now, there are some differences as far as the way in the esoteric traditions, the Aboriginal traditions, how they would view north and south, or what we call north and south. But for the most part, you probably have noticed that no, you're not an astrologer, but actually the tropical system, the sign-based system, does work in the southern hemisphere as much as the northern hemisphere. Why is that? Well, we have some videos on that particular subject.
Oh, fantastic. And you were talking about the lunar standstill and Callanish. So for our members of our audience who don't know where Callanish is, it's in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. I've been fortunate myself to be there twice. I didn't do.
Oh, really? Oh, wow. Incredible. You've been to Callanish.
I've been to Callanish. I sat on, there's a rock right at the top, Mother Turtle Rock. It's a beautiful place out in the moors. I was supposed to go there for the last lunar standstill, but life was life and I didn't get there. So maybe 2000.
Well, actually, just to know this, the place where the exact center point is of the out of bounds moon is actually in January of 2025. And the way that Callanish is set up, the moon will go below the center stone for about 18 months. So actually the full moon near the June solstice in both 2024 and 2025, it's the same. So if you miss 2024, you can do it in 2025.
Yes, and there's a mountain range too, and my Gaelic is really, I'm not even going to try, but it's Sleeping Beauty, and this is where.
Yeah. I'm so close. That's so great. You got a chance to go there. And I was a really good friends with Margaret, who was the. Did you meet her, Margaret
No.
Curtis?
No, I haven't, but I have a number of her books, and she was sort of like the forerunner for all this information about the lunar standstill and mapping it up at Callanish.
She passed away in March, unfortunately, and I was there with her in 1987 when those iconic photos came about. I was standing next to her when she took those photos of the moon walking on the land at that time.
Oh, fantastic! And will you be leading a trip up? Did you say you were leading a trip up to Callanish for the lunar standstill, and all that will be on your website as well?
Yes. What we've done is we booked one of the hotels there, and we actually we have not received from Eileen at that little hotel the exact final pricing, but we have this waiting list. We've already booked the hotel, but we won't know if those individuals are all going to go until they see what the pricing is, you know. But yeah, you can see information about it on our website.
Yeah, so that's fantastic. So a lot of information there for everybody to unpack. So once again, Daniel, thank you very much for being part of this event and so generously sharing your insights and wisdom on the turning of the ages.
Once again, thank you for inviting me again, Frances. It's been my pleasure.
You're more than welcome. And for our audience, Natalia, thank you. I hope you have enjoyed this as much as I have. And I look forward to seeing you again. Blessings.